Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the Society for Digital Mental Health Day 2. Right now we have our parallel flash talk tracks. So there are 8 parallel tracks with different flash talks. This is track number 3, which is engagement and uptake. So we'll have a series of 5 flash talks. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to present. We'll have time for a question or two at the end. If you have questions, I would recommend or ask, also think about putting those into the chat. It's a really great way to have those questions queued up. Also, afterwards, if we're not able to get all of your questions, it allows the speakers an opportunity to answer those questions in the chat as well. So we'll be starting with Laura D'Adamo, I hope I pronounced that right, from Drexel University, who will be presenting participant engagement with a just-in-time adaptive intervention promoting cognitive behavioral skills practice for bulimia nervosa. Thank you so much, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me. Okay, well, so to start us off, CBT is the leading evidence-based treatment that we have for bulimia nervosa. And although it does show efficacy at reducing symptoms, unfortunately, what we see a lot of the time is that a sizable proportion of patients have poor outcomes. So nearly 70% of folks are still partially symptomatic after treatment. One possible reason for that is that patients are not sufficiently acquiring and using the skills that they learned during a full course of CBT. So I'm not going to get into the weeds about this, but just in terms of the skills that I'm talking about here, we teach patients therapeutic skills to address the main treatment targets in the cognitive behavioral model for bulimia nervosa. And just really briefly what those are, those 2 main treatment targets are reducing dietary restraint and trying to increase patients' adaptive responses to cues for engaging in disordered eating behaviors. And these are the skills that we teach to address both of those targets. So really critically, after a therapeutic skill is introduced in treatment in CBT, it's really important for the patient to actually start noticing opportunities for skills use in their everyday lives and actually start using those skills between sessions, because theoretically, adoption and practice of those skills is what is going to drive symptom improvement. Really briefly, we do see support for that in the literature. Won't go into it, but a number of studies have supported that if we improve skills acquisition and use during a full course of CBT, there's potential to improve treatment outcomes. So our question then was, how do we improve skills acquisition and use? So just-in-time adaptive interventions are an intervention paradigm that monitor a person's state in real time and provide individually tailored interventions at times of need. So in a JITAI system aimed to improve skills acquisition and use during CBT for bulimia, the algorithm would learn about a patient's triggers and disordered eating behaviors, usually based on self-report data that the patient has entered. And then the JITAI would use those data to determine the optimal time to provide support and then deliver micro-interventions when the patient would most likely benefit from skills practice. So our team developed a JITAI system based on that model. It's called CBT+. It's designed to augment a full course of CBT for bulimia. And the system comprises a patient app and a clinician portal and uses patient self-monitoring data and weekly treatment goals to deliver personalized micro-interventions at high-risk moments to promote skills practice in everyday life. So the app for patients has digital self-monitoring forms. This is a standard part of CBT at this point, where patients can record all of their eating episodes, as well as their disordered eating behaviors and their urges to engage in any disordered eating and their mood. And then every week in session, patients and their clinicians collaboratively set up to 3 goals for the patient for that week. And this is clinician controlled. So then the clinician goes into the JITAI algorithm via the clinician portal and sets weekly priority goals for the patient. Patients are only going to receive micro interventions that are linked to a priority goal. And then a cool part of this is that clinicians can scale up or scale down the goal to meet the needs of an individual patient. So for instance, in a full course of CBT for BN, what we usually would have the regular eating goal would be 3 meals and 2 snacks, but perhaps you have a patient where you need to start at a lower dose than that, maybe 2 meals and a snack, and then work your way up. You can do that. And then every time a patient enters data in their self-monitoring logs, the algorithm can determine whether there's an opportunity for them to practice a skill based on CBT theory. So for instance, if I have a patient that has an individual priority goal to practice urge management skills when they get an urge to binge, the CBT Plus algorithm will then check their self-monitoring records at each entry and suggest an urge management skill to try when they report an urge in real time. And then in terms of what it looks like when we deploy these JITAIs, first it'll tell the patient, the skill that is identified as the most important to practice, some brief rationale for why that is, and then some instructions on how to actually try it. And then every time an intervention is delivered, we ask patients if they intended to use the recommended skill, and if not, why not? So there are basically no data on participant engagement with JITAI systems for mental health at this point. So that's what we wanted to talk about here, specifically the frequency and nature of self-monitoring, patients' intent to use the skills, and their reasons for not using them. Okay. So participants were from a trial that randomized half the sample to receive JITAIs along 16 weeks of CBT. So this is half of that sample, 31 adults with bulimia and nervosa, who were asked to use the app daily to track their eating, symptoms, mood, urges, and use of CBT skills. And these are demographics. On average, patients had 3 self-monitoring entries a day, so pretty good compliance. 97% of those were meal and snack entries. Patients reported loss of control at 6% of meals and snacks, compensatory behaviors at 5% of entries, had urges about 15% of the time, and low mood 12% of the time. Their rates of skills use were pretty variable over treatment. Frequency of regular eating was quite high, followed by eating enough and breaking food rules. And then of the times that patients reported low mood, they said they used a mood management strategy 68% of the time. Of the times that they had an urge to engage in an eating disorder behavior, they used an urge management strategy 59% of the time. And then in terms of the JITAIs that they received, of those deployed, they actually reported that they intended to use the recommended skills 89% of the time. And I broke that down across the different types of skills. It was pretty high across the board. So highest intent to use the eating enough and the mood management skills, but again, pretty high intention to use the skills that they were recommended. So that's exciting. In terms of reasons for not using the JITAI recommended skills, the most common reasons were that they weren't relevant or the patient was not motivated to try the recommended strategy at that time. So in sum, we saw good compliance with the self-monitoring observed. I think that is relevant because it could have improved the quality or relevance of JITAIs, and relevance it seems to be important for why people are not always responding to them. We saw high intentions to use the skills that might suggest that there's alignment with what patients actually want to see in this kind of intervention. We should see if that actually matters. And the biggest barriers to actually using the skills were lack of relevance and lack of motivation. We are running an R01 trial, or my advisor is at this time, testing this system to see if it's effective at improving skills acquisition and use. But I also thought, for practice, these kinds of systems can offer a lot of insight into patients' triggers, skills use, and barriers to treatment compliance in real time, which clinicians can harness to tailor treatment both within the JITAI system and in session with the patient. So with that, I'll say thank you so much, and I will take questions if we have time. Oh, okay.
Maybe in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker, but there's a couple of questions for you in the chat. So maybe you can answer some of those questions, Laura, in the chat as we go to our next speaker, which is Emily Hersch. So Emily is from the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and she will be presenting on examining college student engagement with a peer support app, implications for student well-being.
Great, thank you. All right, can you see my screen?
We can.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you so much. So my name is Emily Hersch. I am a clinical psychology PhD student at UMass Boston, working at the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring. Today, I'll present on college students' engagement with a peer support mobile application and discuss implications for student success and well-being. So college students are experiencing high rates of mental health, academic, and social challenges. Recent studies have shown that 60% of college students meet criteria for at least one mental health challenge, and 40% of college students drop out without finishing their degree. Unfortunately, many students do not receive needed support from their university due to barriers such as limited staff and stigma associated with formal help seeking. While there are many services available to undergraduate students, navigating these resources can be a challenge. Additionally, research shows that marginalized students, such as students from racial and ethnic minority groups and first-generation students, are at much higher risk of dropping out of college and often experience heightened barriers and stressors such as discrimination, additional financial or household responsibilities, and negative beliefs about help seeking, which can result in lower rates of service utilization compared to their white or continuing generation peers. Given campus service utilization is associated with academic retention and academic performance, novel approaches are needed to support and connect these students with university resources. Luckily, research has shown that peer support and technology-enabled services may help to fill this service gap. Peers have been shown to normalize students' challenges around transitioning to college and help students identify and access campus resources. Online tools can also help connect students to academic and mental health resources at scale. However, research has shown that they may be more effective when paired with human support, which is known as supportive accountability, whereby a coach or peer provides support to an individual to help them engage with an app or resource, in this case, academic resources. University peers may be well situated to serve in these roles. However, few studies have examined students' engagement with peer support apps on college campuses. So our team developed Mentor Pro, which is a peer support mobile application that connects college students with university resources. Students are assigned to a trained peer mentor and use Mentor Pro to set goals and complete weekly check-ins, where students rate their challenges in different areas such as academic habits and well-being. Peer mentors answer student questions, refer students to university resources, and chat directly with students in the app. So in 2021, we conducted a pilot study where we made Mentor Pro accessible to incoming first-year students at a large university, and we found that students were highly engaged with Mentor Pro. And in a study of the second year of implementation, we found that after controlling for background risk factors, first-year students who were more engaged with Mentor Pro had a higher GPA, felt more confident in their ability to be a successful student, and felt more satisfied with their life compared to students with lower engagement. So some of the disparities that racial minority and other underserved students face in connecting with university services, we conducted exploratory analyses to examine how engagement with Mentor Pro may differ by race, first generation and international student status, and explored whether engagement with Mentor Pro was associated with students' end of semester GPA. First and second year students at a large private university in the Northeastern United States were matched to a trained, paid peer mentor and were enrolled in Mentor Pro. We examined students' engagement with the app during fall of 2022, which we defined as the number of times students completed a check-in within the app and the number of messages students sent to their peer mentor. So 6,270 students used Mentor Pro to check in or message their mentor during the fall of 2022. The mean age of our sample was 18.9 years and 62.5% identified as female and 53.1% as non-white. We found that the number of check-ins and messages sent significantly differed between racial groups. Asian students used check-ins significantly more than white students, and multiracial and white students sent fewer messages than Hispanic, Asian, and Black students. First-generation students sent more messages than continuing generation students, and international students completed more check-ins and sent more messages to their peer mentors than non-international students. Lastly, the number of check-ins was positively correlated with students' end of semester GPA. I'll briefly talk about a few limitations. We did not conduct a randomized control trial, so we were unable to draw causal conclusions about the effects of Mentor Pro on student academic and mental health outcomes. Additionally, we did not test whether students' use of Mentor Pro was associated with actual academic service utilization, although we recognize this as an important area for future study. And lastly, we only examined a subset of Mentor Pro students who had used the app to check in or message their mentor. So it's possible our findings may differ if we had included all of the students in our analysis. So in conclusion, students from historically underrepresented and marginalized communities engaged more with their peer mentor and used a self-assessment more frequently than their white peers, suggesting that this type of intervention for increasing access to school resources may be especially appealing to these students. Greater engagement with Mentor Pro was associated with higher GPA. So these findings suggest that Mentor Pro has the potential to increase the accessibility of academic and mental health resources for underserved students and reduce disparities in student service utilization. So this population level intervention leverages technology and peer support to improve student academic outcomes and well-being at scale. So in the future, we will conduct randomized control trials to test the effects of Mentor Pro on students' academic and mental health outcomes, as well as students' engagement with mental health apps. And we will conduct focus groups with students from historically marginalized communities to better understand how we can improve Mentor Pro to best meet students' needs. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I have a quick question, maybe Emily. I might have missed this, but where are the mentors coming from on Mentor Pro? Are these, and how are they kind of matching some of the backgrounds of these potentially underserved students?
Yeah, great question. So these mentors were recruited from an existing mentoring program within the university. So other universities might not have that same kind of infrastructure, but these were paid and trained mentors that we recruited from this program. And they were, we didn't match them specifically to these students, but I think that would definitely be kind of an area of future research.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, maybe we can move on to the next presenter. If there's more questions for Emily, again, you can put into the chat. I see there's some vibrant conversation going on with regards to the previous presentation as well. So next up, we have Qiang from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will be presenting on Is More Meditation Better? Examining dose effects in a freely available meditation app.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Qiang. I'm a incoming third-year counseling psychology Ph.D. student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the mentorship of Dr. Simon Goldberg. I'm also a graduate research assistant in the Center for Healthy Minds. So today, I would like to present our study on the effect of dosage in a freely available meditation app. So first of all, meditation has gained large popularity in America. So specifically, about 1 out of 5 American adults practiced meditation in 2017. And meditation is a family of contemplative practices involving training in attention and emotion regulation. So research showed that meditation-based interventions have the potential to improve mental and physical health. Although there's some evidence showing the benefit of traditional meditation-based interventions, they have some limitations. For example, there are some logistical barriers like scheduling difficulties, commuting, or financial costs to attend the training, or substantial time commitment to engage in the training. So smartphone-delivered interventions may address the limitations of traditional meditation-based interventions. They may potentially increase access to and effectiveness of meditation-based interventions. So meditation practice is purported to be a central ingredient in meditation-based interventions, specifically mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy both encourage participants to engage in home practice for 45 minutes per day. In theory, high dose of meditation practice is more effective, but less accessible, and low dose of meditation practice is less effective, but more accessible. So empirically, do we know the dose-response relationship in smartphone-delivered meditation-based interventions? Well, for traditional meditation-based interventions, a meta-analysis showed that there is a small to moderate association between cumulative home practice duration and post-intervention outcomes in traditional meditation-based interventions. However, the dose-response relationship in smartphone-based meditation-based interventions is less well understood. For example, one study showed that more frequent use of the Calm meditation app is associated with greater health changes. However, another study showed that the number of completed sessions in an app-based mindfulness intervention did not predict improvement in perceived stress from pre to post intervention. So given that there's limited evidence on the dose outcome relationship in smartphone-based meditation training, the current study tested the dose-response relationship in a freely available meditation app, which is the Healthy Minds program. So the Healthy Minds program was rated by the New York Times as the best budget pick among the meditation apps So the HMP focused on training in awareness, mindful awareness, connection, healthy connection, insights, and purpose in life. In this study, we included over 7,000 users of the public version of HMP who voluntarily used the app for a period for 1 month. And the participants completed the perceived stress scale at the start and end of 1 month. So we extracted the number of days participants engaged in meditation practice and the number of minutes they engaged in practice and the number of practices they completed. So we found that the users are predominantly white, female, and highly educated. And also, on average, participants used the HMP app for about 10 days. They engaged in meditation practice for about 100 minutes. They completed the practices, about like 10 practices. So we found that perceived stress significantly improved from pre to post intervention with a small effect. Also, dosage of app usage is associated with improvement in perceived stress. So specifically, the number of days, number of minutes, and the number of practices all significantly predicted changes in perceived stress. And we also found that the dose-response relationship was not moderated by participant demographics, which specifically is race, ethnicity, education, age, and marital status. So overall conclusion, the dosage of meditation app usage seems to be associated with improvement in perceived stress among users who persist in using free meditation apps. The current study has several limitations. So first of all, we did not examine the relationship between momentary app use and outcomes. So we are not sure about the dosage outcome relationship in a more fine-grained level. And also the participants were restricted to those who persisted in using the app. So we are not sure whether the conclusion can be applied to participants who dropped out during the 1 month period. And lastly, we did not manipulate the dosage, so we cannot infer causality based on the current study. For future studies, we propose that future experimental studies are warranted to examine the causal impact of dosage on outcomes in smartphone-delivered meditation-based interventions and examine factors that may make the dosage most efficient and effective. Yeah, please let me know if you have any questions. And I left my email box here, so feel free to reach out to me if you have questions after the conference as well.
Fantastic. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute, drop it in the chat. There's a question here in the chat. Were analyses adjusted to baseline levels of perceived stress? I can imagine those with higher stress likely wanted to use the app more than those with lower levels.
You mean whether we controlled the baseline levels of perceived stress?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry, my camera's not working for some reason.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. So the statistics in this presentation, when we conduct that statistic analysis, we did not control for stress level, but I think it's a very meaningful thing to do in the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks. It was really good. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's another question. What recommendations for app use did participants receive? So I'm not sure. Can you clarify what do you mean by recommendations?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My question stands were they advised use it whenever you can, or use it for a minimum of that many minutes a day or that many minutes a week? I know that certain apps have specific recommendations about how often and how to use the app or when to use the app or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for traditional meditation-based interventions like MBSR or MBCT, they usually encourage participants to engage in practice for like 45 minutes per day, right? But for the Healthy Minds program, we did not send like recommendations to participants, like encourage them to practice for a certain amount of days, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and the questions. Feel free to drop more questions in the chat if you want. And please do look in those questions in the chat and answer them. We'll move on to our next presentation, which will be Molly Knowles. Molly comes to us from Rutgers School of Public Health, and she'll be presenting on engaging with one-on-one care modalities increases digital mHealth resource use, a prospective longitudinal study.
Thank you. Let me get this all teed up. All right. Can everyone see my, oh, it's taking a second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Knowles. I'm a PhD candidate in health systems and policy at the Rutgers School of Public Health. And unlike, I think, most of the other presenters here, I am a health services researcher and not a psychologist. And so I'm learning a lot from everyone's talks, although most of my co-authors are psychologists. So hopefully this is interesting to everyone as well. So I'm talking today about engaging with one-on-one care modalities and how that interacts with a digital health resource, mHealth resource use. And so I guess let's move forward. Okay. So we know that tech-enhanced mental health platforms may help with scalability and accessibility of mental health care, but it's very important to understand that what predicts engagement with these types of platforms. And so understanding this will actually help to maximize user engagement and provide better, more optimized mental health care. And so the purpose of our study was to examine predictors of engagement in these digital mental health treatments that are offered as part of an employer-sponsored mental health benefit with this app. So this app is from Modern Health, which is an employer-sponsored mental health benefit program. So we used a longitudinal design. We used usage data from employees who had access to and signed up for an employer-sponsored digital mental health healthcare benefit. So Modern Health collected data prospectively and longitudinally. Participants had access to a variety of digital resources, including daily exercises, interactive programs, podcasts, and mindfulness exercises. They also had access to one-on-one telecoaching and teletherapy, and then they could use those, if they were recommended and if they wanted to. The outcome of our analysis was actually the number of times a participant used these digital mHealth resources. These are self-directed resources. And we use Poisson regression modeling to investigate the primary predictors of this outcome. So this included demographics, baseline patient activation, baseline mental health literacy, baseline depression and anxiety scores, their self-reported primary reason for engaging in treatment, as well as two binary indicators for whether they used any telecoaching and any teletherapy sessions. So we observed participants from when they enrolled in the platform to 3 months later, and the number of digital mental health resource use times they've used and the use of these one-on-one modalities were actually recorded like concurrently. So in that time period, so it's the number of outcome is the number of times that they engaged in these self-directed digital resources over the 3-month period, and then same with the one-on-one modalities is whether or not they used those modalities in that same time period. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in total, we had 950 participants in our sample with a mean age of about 34 years of age, relatively high educational attainment, and a plurality endorsed that their emotions were the primary reason that they were seeking treatment. We ended up splitting our sample into 4 major groups: those who didn't use either one-on-one modalities or self-directed resources, those who only used one-on-one modalities, those using only self-directed resources, and then those who used both types of modalities. And you could see that we had differences at baseline in age, PHQ-9, GAD-7, mental health literacy scores, and primary concern
for entering treatment between these different groups. You might also notice that about 44% of our sample did not use either modality, which kind of aligns with what we know about engagement in these platforms kind of overall. In terms of our adjusted modeling, you can see that several factors were significantly associated with increased engagement in these self-directed resources. Primarily for this analysis, we're focused on the use of coaching and therapy. We found that use of any telecoaching sessions in that period were associated with an 82% increase in the number of times someone used self-directed digital resources, and use of any teletherapy was associated with about an 80% increase. We also saw that older age, identifying as a woman, and all primary concerns beyond my emotions, so my finances, physical well-being, professional life, and relationships were all significantly associated with increased engagement. Interestingly, we saw that the patient activation score, the higher the score, the lower engagement was, which was kind of inversely associated from what I had expected. In terms of our conclusions, as I said, we saw higher self-directed engagement among those who used one-on-one modalities, which might be a result of providers encouraging their clients to use these resources, or it's possible that these participants are kind of super users of all resources, and that using one modality kind of begets increased engagement or increased likelihood of using other modalities. However, this data was not collected in a way that kind of allowed determining sequencing of events. And so we don't know whether participants used one-on-one modalities first or vice versa. So we can't actually tease out this explanation with this study, but that's kind of a limitation of this work. And hopefully we're able to do that in a further iteration. So in conclusion, we know that digital health platforms can be leveraged to deliver evidence-based mental health care to large populations, but they do appear to be affected by similar engagement challenges as other treatment modalities. And our findings suggest that a potential key to successful engagement with these self-directed health resources may lie in actually providing additional live support.
Fantastic. That was great, Molly. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have time for a couple questions. I'll jump in with a question to start. Is there, kind of on this point you just made about some of the challenges in terms of seeing engagement in the digital as well as the other traditional services, was there any analysis that you did to maybe look at different predictors of people who tend to engage in digital versus the other services? Like, is this an aspect of market segmentation? Some people might be more interested in digital, whereas others might be more interested in traditional care.
We haven't done that, but that's a great question for like a potential further study. Yeah.
Awesome. But yeah, it seems like you have great data to be able to look at a lot of cool questions like that, which is awesome.
Yeah, we have a great sample.
I have a quick question if we have time.
Go for it.
Hi, Molly. I was curious if you had the chance to look into if like with the breakdown or if there were any patterns in terms of which of the like self-help digital resources people were using more than others.
We haven't split it out because there tended to be relatively few uses kind of overall of across, but that is a great question that might be worth exploring kind of in a follow-up analysis.
Thank you.
Maybe have time for one more question. Okay, well, if you have other questions for Molly, feel free to drop into the chat, or we might even have a chance to roll back to some questions here at the end. But we will move it along to our last presenter, which is Ian Miller from Limbix, who will be presenting on a digital therapeutic for adolescents with symptoms of depression, feasibility of a multi-phase, decentralized, randomized clinical trial.
Hello, thank you, Stephen. Can everyone see the screen all right? Yeah. We
can.
Well, thanks, Stephen, and thanks to all the other presenters before me. Really interesting topics that we're kind of intersecting on today. But yes, my name is Ian Miller. I am from Limbix. Just to start off, Limbix, we create digital therapeutics for adolescent mental health disorders. Stating conflict of interest here, we were the sponsor of this clinical trial. We ran it internally. So I just want to put that up front before we kind of dive in. As you know, I probably don't need to tell most of us here that there is a problem of adolescent depression in the United States and globally. We're seeing year-over-year increases in prevalence, hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and we know that between 60 and 80% of adolescents are not receiving the appropriate or timely treatment for their mental health disorders in this country. So while there's really been general scientific, knowledge and medical care have really greatly advanced substantially in recent years, especially within our digital mental health space, we do know that African Americans, Hispanics, and other U.S. minority groups have really benefited less from these advances, than compared to their white counterparts. And a lot of this is really directly pointing to the lack of diversity in clinical trials. Also, a lot of what was being talked about earlier in the panels this morning of kind of ensuring representation of these diverse groups when we're developing these treatments and things like that. But a lot of it's really pointing to this lack of diversity in clinical trials and leading to questions about who has access to and who can really benefit from these treatments. So as we alluded to a second ago, I'm speaking to the feasibility of an RCT of a digital therapeutic called SparkRx for adolescents aged 13 to 21 with symptoms of depression. Really quickly, it's a 5-week self-guided curriculum that's based entirely in cognitive behavioral therapy, really focuses on behavioral activation aspect of that. But what I really like to highlight here is that SparkRx was co-designed with teens, so they really had a direct kind of relationship with us while we were developing the program, choosing the type of curriculum that goes into it and all of that. So really ensuring that we're raising the patient's hand as we kind of like to talk about it in the development of Spark. But today I want to touch on the feasibility of our virtual recruitment methods, and then also talk about really quickly the acceptability of Spark from our patient population. Before I dig into that, just in terms of study design, this was a fully virtual, decentralized trial. So we recruited primarily through digital channels. That's Facebook, Instagram, things like that. And we were targeting patients that were aged 13 to 21 with self-reported symptoms of depression. I will note that for participants under 18, we are actually recruiting through their caregivers on these digital channels. But then interested participants could attend a 1-hour virtual onboarding session where they would eventually sign consent to participate, and they were compensated for weekly questionnaire completion. And then lastly, just noting that this was a multi-phased RCT, so you're going to see a couple of references to phase 1 and phase 2, just kind of noting that before we move on here. But first, in terms of the results for our feasibility of virtual recruitment, we had a 19% enrollment rate across both phases of the clinical trial. So we saw just over 1,100 kids register their interest in participating, and actually 220 of those ended up enrolling and consenting into the study. For study retention, that was also very high. It was about 78% across both phases of the trial. So of those total 220 patients that enrolled, 172 of them actually completed the entire 5-week intervention. Both of these rates, we're very happy with. We feel like they're pretty on par with other literature and kind of what we would have expected from this population. But really what I want to highlight today is our participant demographics. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a map. We saw a pretty nice distribution of enrollment across the country with recruitment from, almost half of the 50 states in the United States. Our sample was about 2/3 female, which is kind of common for these types of trials and aligned with prevalence data of depression in this population. On the right-hand side, you can see breakdowns by gender, ethnicity, and race. Our sample was predominantly white and non-Hispanic, but there were rates of historically underrepresented groups. We're fairly reasonably aligned with US Census and prevalence data, although there's certainly room for some improvement in our ability to recruit those groups a little bit better. What I do like to really highlight here is that nearly 20% of our participants identified as coming from rural or suburban areas. So it's really nice to know that we're actually reaching folks that may not have traditionally had access to that more site-based clinical trial, in-person clinical trial opportunities. And then lastly, just hitting on the acceptability of SparkRx from this patient population. Participants rated the app as highly usable and engaging, which, I really think, and we think here at Limbix, is a testament to our co-design approach and really including the teens throughout our development process. So you can see those ratings on either side of phase 1 and phase 2 for the usability and engagement of SparkRx. Overall, Spark was found to be acceptable by our participants. Both trial phases were moderately successful in recruiting samples with diverse racial and ethnic identities. We enrolled patients from nearly half of the United States and reached those rural and urban areas. So this virtual trial method in our eyes was feasible and very successful. Overall, we just really think it's important that we reach these underserved communities that have historically been excluded from clinical research and really facilitate a more inclusive development process of mental health treatments for adolescents in need. So thank you all.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. Questions for Ian? There's one in the chat already. Keen to learn more about recruitment through digital channels. Could you share more about your channels and the messages you used for it?
Sure. Yeah, so like I said, mostly for this previous trial that we ran a couple of years ago, it was primarily through Facebook and Instagram. We actually recently completed another pivotal trial that was all virtual. And again, our best success was through those kind of Facebook channels, those types of digital channels. And one thing that we really focused on for that second trial was testing our messaging, right? We actually went to the users or our kind of target population of who we were recruiting and kind of trying to understand the type of messaging that really resonates for them to enroll or kind of list their interest in these trials. Some of the messaging that we kind of saw that was most impactful was around kind of the trust in these digital tools and the trust in, a company that has a stake in the product that we're testing. So really kind of being transparent in these landing pages and the messaging that we put out there about the benefits that this can really, provide the participants.
Yeah, a similar question, Ian. Were those messages developed through similar co-design processes that you guys used in the intervention? I think this recruitment aspect is really interesting, and it's interesting to think about maybe ways you could think about changing some aspects of the recruitment to try to get more, men or, more racial and ethnic diversity as well.
Right. Yeah. So for this trial, we actually didn't really co-design or test a lot of the recruitment methods for this next pivotal trial that we're just getting results in for now. We did do a lot of that co-design and testing, pulling kids in and doing interviews with them and, running them through mock landing pages and kind of asking, what are your thoughts? What do you, need? What do you expect from a company like ours to kind of, give you enough information to feel comfortable to sign up and participate with us?
And Ian, there's another question in the chat. Did you define retention as completion of the full intervention? And what do you think led to these excellent retention rates? So kind of curious on how you guys are defining retention here.
Yeah, so retention is defined as completing that final, it's a 5-week intervention, completing the final 5-week intervention questionnaire. So at that end time point that they complete that last questionnaire is kind of how we define retention. One thing that we think that led to excellent retention, partially, we hope that it's the app, that it was, kids enjoyed using the app and wanted to continue using it. There was a little bit of, maybe feelings of accountability. We were checking in just once a week, just kind of saying as research coordinators, hey, make sure you, fill out your questionnaires this week. Do you have any technical kind of difficulties that you need help with? So there was a little, not much hand-holding through the process, but there's certainly maybe some possibility for some of that, feelings of accountability from the participants.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we have 5 minutes left over, so I would open it up if people have questions for any of the presenters, or maybe even questions that would go across the multiple presentations. I know, all these presentations kind of touched on aspects of engagement and uptake in digital mental health interventions in different ways. Feel free to, ask a question that would go across the presenters as well. Alexandra.
Yeah, hi everyone. Maybe a question for all of you, all the presenters. I'm actually curious. Have you considered working with the industry team to source data of their users to get like higher volumes of data you could work with, and what are the challenges for doing so?
Any of the presenters, feel free to jump in. I mean, and I know, as Ian mentioned, he's part of the team at Limbic, so you might
Give
have
me
a
like
different
5 minutes.
view from the development side.
I can just jump in. So not part of this study, but our team has partnered with Healthy Minds and Headspace, and we're using those apps, and we're able to see sort of granular user data, which helps us understand user engagement. And also in our lab, we focus on supportive accountability. So thinking about how we can get peers to sort of personalize support around that usage. So that's how we're kind of partnering with industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an industry perspective, we certainly like to, partner with hospital systems, other research institutes to run clinical trials, collect as much data as we can, and share it back to kind of get into these more granular questions, right? We like to partner with hospital systems that maybe treat specific pediatric focuses. So we can kind of see, how does this app work for, patients with chronic pain that also have depression or something like that. So definitely lots of interest in partnering with, other folks in industry, excuse me.
Great, thanks. Paige, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for a wonderful round of talks. So in terms of like accessibility and uptake, and for some of the talks, like working with younger adults, and actually people who are not quite 18, what like digital mental health interventions is seen as a way to like overcome barriers where maybe there might be stigma about talking to a parent about mental health issues, and maybe not being able to have a parent take you to get mental health treatment. And I wondered, for those of you for whom this is relevant, just sort of, I guess, the ethical or the safeguards that you put in place, so that like what happens when there might be a 17-year-old who wants to use one of your platforms or services, but without their parents' permission.
I can take a quick stab at that. Obviously, what we've encountered at Limbics is there's different laws in different states of who needs to be notified when a child receives treatment. So it is a little bit difficult to kind of get around the parental or caregiver involvement piece of it. And so, we do our best to kind of highlight to, we really market this through providers. So they're seeing the patients in office already and recommending it to their patients, most likely with their parents in the background signing off. But it is kind of one of those situations where we have to be careful and make sure that all of our labeling is very clear of who this is intended for, what are our clinical results, what does all the data say, and really going back to just making people feel as comfortable as possible in the products that we're putting out there, and that they are being protected.
Anyone else? Thoughts about that protection, especially of children, and also the opportunities to provide sort of services for that room, and open up access in these digital spaces? I know it's a question, like I've seen some really interesting work, Paige, kind of going off of this about studies that have done waivers of parental consent and how that actually overcomes some of the demographic challenges, I think, that were raised in some of the work that you presented, Ian, about trying to get more, especially racial and ethnic minorities, as well as sexual and gender minorities. And so I think it is this really interesting question about the ethics around that. I know, here in California, minorities 12 and above are allowed to consent for mental health services, but they're not allowed to consent for research. And so there's interesting sort of differences in terms of access to mental health versus access to being in research studies, which I think is challenging to navigate sometimes for some of this different work, but important to think about. Great. Well, thanks again to all of our wonderful presenters. This was a really, really great session. And thanks everyone for joining. For a reminder for what's coming next on the agenda, we'll have a 15-minute break now, and then we'll have another series of Ask Me Anything sessions. So we have 5 parallel tracks during the Ask Me Anything. And so take a quick break and then jump in one of those sessions. And thanks so much for the presenters for submitting your work to the Society for Digital Mental Health, and everyone else for coming. It's been great to have you.